by training, I'm a cardiologist and medical anthropologist, and I think it was mentioned, I work on a set of programs around non-communicable diseases that are really focused on the burden of disease and those folks living in extreme poverty. For me, what really drew me to this field was that among those living in extreme poverty, the majority of them are women, as we know, and most of them actually do not smoke. Very few of them smoke or are overweight or drink to any significant extent. And really the only unifying risk factor for them in terms of these non-communicable diseases that you could point to would be household air pollution. And in fact, it's the one that's not recognized in any of the global frameworks that are set up to advise countries on how to manage non-communicable disease. So this set of initiatives is aimed to advise governments in their NCD divisions on what they should be doing, and we hope that this can be a vehicle for getting some of the messages that are coming out of this group to that hopefully important audience. Today we have an absolutely incredible group of panelists, and I've calculated that collectively probably between them there's 100 years, a century probably of experience dealing with this issue. If you do the math, I think that's probably about right. And they're speaking really at an amazing moment where I think maybe for the first time perhaps we're taking this issue as a health problem as seriously as we should, as seriously as other global health problems. And we're talking about solutions that are really going to get to impact and what it's going to take to do that. And we're also making the bridges that this issue makes possible between, on the one hand, of course, the climate change community and the health community, and then also within the health community between the communicable and non-communicable disease communities, for an opportunity to prevent potentially 4 million deaths, which is really quite extraordinary, especially considering that those are really concentrated among the poor. I think I would like to maybe start the discussion with Anita Shankar, who's here from the Johns Hopkins Bloomberg School of Public Health, where she's at the Center for Clean Air. She's an anthropologist, and her work is really focused on women's empowerment. And I think it's fascinating to start with her work because, as we mentioned, this is really an issue of significantly of people living in poverty and in extreme poverty in particular, and of those, women are clearly overrepresented. And in many ways, it's well known and well understood that this is an issue that impacts women on so many levels. In terms of their exposure because of what they do on a day-to-day basis, both to cooking itself and to the effort involved in collecting biomass. But a story that Professor Shankar is telling that I think isn't as well understood is the enormous opportunity that improvements in this area really represent for women economically as entrepreneurs, and what she's learned in the course of her career in terms of how to take advantage of that and sort of the shocking lack of work for women in this area. So it'd be great to hear her thoughts on this.
Thanks very much, and thank you all of you for listening on this panel. We're really at a very exciting time for women's empowerment, and one of the things that we've really been excited around the cookstove space is that we're able to address a very critical women's issue, because women by far suffer the greatest impacts of household air pollution and also are involved in gathering the fuels. But such a great opportunity to be able to engage women more effectively throughout the sector. With a tremendous amount of support from the Global Alliance that has a very clear gender strategy and recognizes the importance of engaging women and the necessity to engage women at every aspect of the value chain in order to be able to scale this adoption and scale clean cooking solutions globally. So a lot of the women's empowerment efforts have been looking at women having increased access to energy or cleaner cooking solutions, and their empowerment is considered to be a byproduct of this increased clean energy access. But what we also know is that women comprise, especially in the developing countries, one of the growing cohort of micro-entrepreneurs. And not only do women know cooking, and they know how to sell cooking and how to be able to, and anything associated with that, they can explain how to use it well. So it's not just getting the cook stove that's important, it's about using it correctly and using it consistently. And based on our research, we're really seeing that women are a critical factor in being able to do that. Should I go ahead and talk about our research?
Yes, please.
Okay. So we have been very interested in how we can engage women more effectively as entrepreneurs in the clean cooking value chain. One, we want to be able to see, can women sell cook stoves just as well as men, who tend to predominate the distribution system? But knowing that women as entrepreneurs suffer from many psychosocial challenges, whether being able to address that through an agency-based empowerment training, a training that's designed to actually help improve their intrinsic motivation, their self-efficacy, and their capacity individually, would that help them to be able to sell better? And we also wanted to see if a woman sold the cook stove, is adoption better? So we conducted a randomized trial in Kenya with about over 250 entrepreneurs, both men and women, and they were broken up into two groups. One group got a standard entrepreneurial training. The other group got an agency-based empowerment training. Both of those trainings lasted about 4 days, and then we watched them for about 8 months in terms of sales activity. And over the course of that time, we found that women not only were able to sell as many cook stoves as men, they surpassed them by almost 3 to 1. So given equal opportunity, women have the capacity to be able to sell much better than men. The agency-based empowerment training had a tremendous impact on the business activity and the capacity of these cook stove sellers to sell as well, for both men and women, but most specifically for women. So if a woman went through this empowerment training, they were 2.7 times more likely to be a higher seller of cook stoves. And so to kind of round out that whole picture, when we talked to the adoptees, it was clear that when a woman sold a cook stove, the woman understood how to use it. She used it more consistently, correctly, and more often. So, yeah.
That's absolutely wonderful. And I thought these results were incredible, and especially given the current low level of involvement of women in this business, that it just makes complete sense that this is what they really know best, or they are the ones who know this best, and the work that you're doing to empower them to be able to propagate these kinds of technologies is amazing. I'd like to shift maybe to Professor Kirk Smith at the University of California, Berkeley, who knows the history of this field extremely well. And I guess I would transition by asking, so we have a vehicle here potentially that has a lot of benefits in terms of women increasing distribution and penetration of these technologies. What kinds of technologies should they be distributing? And given that the last many decades we've really had a field that's promoted stoves, improved biomass stoves that aren't huge improvements, you're really saying that we need to go dramatically further and maybe talk about that, but also what is the role of government? What is the role of the market, women, and I would also mention that you're working full time in India currently with the government there.
Okay, thank you. So, sorry, 35 years as a professor, I am unable to talk sitting down, and I also, mostly unable to talk without slides, but I try to remember today, we don't have slide capability, the old Greek statement that power corrupts and PowerPoint corrupts absolutely. So, no slides. But I have a very strong health bias. Keep this in mind. There are many other benefits for improving the cooking situation in developing countries. Time savings, women's status, perhaps some climate benefits and so forth. But I'm talking about health. Health is what's driven us here. And, we're at a turning point in human history. Last week, for the first time in human history, we have a definition of clean from a health standpoint. These are the World Health Organization's air quality guideline, indoor air quality guidelines that came out. And I'm not going to go into the detail, but let me tell you, it's very clean. You have to be very clean to get the health benefits. You want to get at that 4 million premature deaths, that's compared to what? Compared to gas. And there isn't, I'm afraid, any biomass stove in the world today on the market that comes close to that. So there's a challenge here for all of us. Obviously, you're not going to move everybody to gas and electricity right away, but we have to look at things becoming very clean. Now, in public health, and I think the definition of public health is the art and science of making people healthy before they're wealthy, and then keeping them that way when they get wealthy. And we look for magic bullets. We look for levers to do that. We know some of these levers: vaccines, inexpensive antibiotics, antiretroviral drugs, bed nets. There are a few magic levers or levers that work to make people healthy before they're wealthy. We don't know whether we found a way to do that with cookstoves yet. Now, there's a very sobering counterexample. How long ago was it that we accepted the causality of human waste and human disease? You thought we could learn this 10,000 years ago, but no. We learned it only about 125 years ago. That's when the big sanitation movements began, the sewage systems went in around the world and so forth. Have we fixed it? No, there's still millions of people dying because of fecal matter in the water around the world. Just knowing that there's a problem, as I think we've come to accept now for household air pollution, doesn't mean you know how to fix it. And I'm worried that 125 years from now, we're going to be, in another meeting like this, saying, how are we going to do this? And the sanitation people are still struggling to learn how to get this done in poor populations. Now, there are basically two approaches to dealing with this, in my opinion. One is the approach we've all been taking for decades, or actually in case of India, since the 1950s, and which is to make the available clean. That is, to make available fuels, biomass that you gather from the ground, clean. That has the big attraction that it's right there. People are familiar with it. It's free, and so forth. But actually, burning it cleanly, particularly given what we understand now is needed for clean, is extremely difficult from a technical standpoint. Extremely difficult on a reliable basis, because biomass is quite varied. It's dirty one day and wet the next day and so forth. Women aren't concerned about, they don't operate the stoves like a laboratory technician. They're just concerned it's just cooking. You can get efficiency and cooking from something that is not clean. In fact, most of the time, that's what happens. So I think this challenge means we need to step up. We need to actually treat this problem at the scale that it deserves. Now, how do we develop vaccines? We don't get, NGOs and professors in little laboratories to develop vaccines for us. We get the very best manufacturers in the scientific laboratories in the world to do that. And we evaluate them very rigorously. This is what we need to do if we're going to make the available clean. So some colleagues and I have been proposing what we call the Heart of the Hearth Innovation Prize, a prize of a big enough stature, best designed in such a way to get the really important big guys involved. I mean, people like GE and Rolls-Royce and BMW and Honda and Tata Industries, the guys that really understand combustion. See if they can get us something, a combustion chamber that can be brought to a village. The stove can be built around it. The stove is kind of the phenotype. The combustion chamber is what we're worried about in terms of health. Really clean, really robust, the best technology in the world applied to this problem. No, if we get a negative result out of that, that's going to tell us something about whether we can ever rely on making the available clean. The other side is, of course, to make the clean available. We know what's clean. Everybody in this room uses it. It's gas or electricity or both. That's what's clean. That's what's aspirational. That's what works. Every cuisine in the world is cooked fine on gas and electricity. It's the aspirational thing that everybody wants. 60% of the world uses this now. There's not a question of what works. Question is how to get it down to poor people. So that's an effort we're working on in India. It's making the available clean initiative. Making the clean available initiative, trying to push gas down to poor populations, and any kind of gas, biogas, LPG, natural gas, whatever kind of gas, it's clean. Electrical appliances are part of the cooking picture. As electrification proceeds in India, electric appliances are coming in. We need better ones, cheaper ones, more reliable ones, ones that meet people's needs better. The markets are designed for urban areas. We need to design them for rural areas. I was just in a village 2 days ago in India. I just came in yesterday. Every house in the village had an induction stove because some salesman had come through, sold everybody an induction stove. That village didn't even have 100% electricity yet, but they were using these stoves, not 100%, and liked them. Where can that go? Where can induction stoves go? I don't know. But they're a leapfrog technology. They're more efficient. They're clean, perfectly clean. They're faster. They're safer. Your sari falls on the stove. It doesn't catch on fire. Your kid puts his hand on the stove. He doesn't get scalded. They're a leapfrog technology. They're not your grandmother's stove. I don't know how far that can go, but we need to learn that. The same kind of behavioral issues in terms of all of these technologies, how do you get people to use them, come into play. But one argument about gas and electricity, at least you start with something that's clean. Then you have to worry about paying for it, disseminating it, financing it, and so forth. But that's, across the board. Now, we have learned some other things, and these things are kind of sobering. I just want to mention one that's different, for example, from 5 years ago when the alliance was initiated. We now understand that probably the most effective kind of interventions are not at the household level. They're not household by household, but at the village level. And if you think about it, if you're in a village and you're not even cooking at all, or in a slum, you're not cooking at all, but all your neighbors are using an open fire, you're going to get a lot of pollution too. The pollution doesn't stay in the house. We don't call it indoor air pollution anymore. It goes out of the house. It goes back into the bedroom. It goes next door. It goes down the street. Becomes part of outdoor air pollution. 26% of outdoor air pollution in India is due to open cook fires. So just one household at a time doesn't really get at this problem completely. The sanitation people have learned this. One latrine at a time doesn't do it. If you get a latrine and all your neighbors are defecating, in the fields, you're not going to get any. You don't see any health benefit. But the intervention strategies for a community level interventions are quite different than those at a household by household. But there are advantages. It's much more efficient to provide the fuel, say electricity or LPG, or even better biomass stoves on a village scale to service them, to deal with the warranties and so forth, than it is on a household scale. But the biggest advantage is the social advantage. How do you change behavior? I've got experienced colleagues say that human behavior has never been changed without social pressure being exerted. So how do you unleash social pressure? Like the anti-tobacco people have learned. The first thing the Tobacco Control Convention says, the International Convention, is have anti-smoking laws, no smoking laws in your public places. You change the social context. That's what we need to do with stoves or clean fuels. And in order to do that, though, you have to do it at the community scale. You don't have to smoke, but you do have to cook. So everybody in the village has to have access to something that's cleaner. So these are some of the lessons that we've learned. It's a very big problem. It requires big solutions that if you look at it from a health basis, please throw out your ideology. Don't worry about renewability. It's not the cooking of the poor that's causing climate change. It's you and me that are causing climate change. If you want renewable cooking, do it yourself. Don't ask the poor to do it for you. Honestly. Get them something clean. And a business model. Sure, we need to do the private sector, but that doesn't have to be household to household sales. Procurement. And we don't sell vaccines household to household, but we have very good vaccines. It's the private sector that does it for us. The highest quality private sectors in the world in the biotech industry. But that's done, in a different kind of context. It's done at the community scale. And also, last plea is in the health field, we don't talk about subsidies. We don't subsidize vaccines for the poor. It's a social investment. Vaccines for the poor are a social investment. Well, part of this clean fuel agenda is a social investment. But one of the things to say that, and mean it, we have to target the so-called subsidies better, and that's one of the things we're working on in India, is to move. I get a LPG subsidy when I live in Delhi. All my, professor colleagues and medical doctors and so forth. That's crazy. You've got to target the subsidies to the poor. Then you can start calling it social investment. It has maybe it's just a change in words, but it means it's a very big difference in implications. So thank you very much.
I'd like to transition now to Solomon Mpoke, who's the director of the Kenya Medical Research Institute and also the chief research officer there. We've had some great ideas about what needs to be delivered and maybe how it can be delivered or how the distribution of it can increase. How do we study whether this is effective in principle and in fact programmatically? And this is something I know that you've been thinking about quite a bit in Kenya at a national level.
Thank you. Thank you very much. First of all, I want to really thank the Global Alliance for Clean Stoves for hosting such a wonderful forum. And I also want to say how happy I am to be here this morning. I come from a public health perspective as the head of one of the premier research institutes in Kenya, Kenya Medical Research Institute. We are tackling a double disease burden, non-communicable diseases and communicable diseases. And when we talk about clean stoves, we are actually addressing both communicable and non-communicable. We have a research infrastructure in Kenya, specifically at KEMRI, where we believe we can make significant contributions to the promotion of clean energy, clean use of energy. In one of our stations in Kisumu, we have a demographic surveillance site where we have about 250,000 people whom we can reach. So if it is an issue of evaluating the significance, for example, of the clean stoves, that is a population where that kind of study can be undertaken. We also have, not very far from the KEMRI Nairobi headquarters, we have the Kibera slums, one of the largest and most studied slums in Africa. We can also, and we've done in the past, studies to evaluate any kind of intervention that is actually administered in that particular setup. Some years ago, we conducted studies on upper respiratory infections within the Kibera slums. And we did see that there is a huge problem that is occasioned by household air pollution. We believe the clean stoves is going to provide a solution to actually tackling that particular problem. In a study that was done in Kisumu, involving about 45 households, we actually got some very interesting results. Of course, the issue of clean stoves is widely acceptable. But then that particular study brought out other issues that we need to take on board. For example, what is the preference of the cooking media that the people that you want to introduce into this, what do they prefer? There are people who probably are so used to the traditional methods of cooking. And maybe if you introduce a clean stove, will it deliver the kind of food that they want within the time frame that they actually want? So there are so many other small logistical areas that I think we need to do as we introduce these clean energies. So the role of KEMRI is actually to be able to evaluate these particular interventions and provide evidence that can be used to inform a policy. As a public research institute, we actually generate results and advise the government. As one of the panelists has said, what eventually will be required here is that You introduce an intervention. You evaluate that intervention. If you get good results, then you, as Camry, we would advise the government. And the government will then take that into policy. And Clean Stoves is going to be a social intervention that I think we can apply to our population. Thank you very much.
Yeah, it's going to be really exciting to see what's coming out of Kenya, and I understand that it seems like there's a high level commitment to doing something about this there. So I'd like to ask Jim Zhang, who is based at Duke University, has worked in a number of countries, but very significantly in China, and documented really the positive health outcomes of the work that was done around 2008 in the Beijing Olympics on reducing sources of ambient air pollution from cars and factories and whatnot. But he's really also speaking to the significant role of household air pollution, and maybe understanding to what extent that the Chinese government is aware of that and sees it as part of the same continuum or same problem.
Thank you. Good morning to everyone. It's really a pleasure to be here. I started my research career 26 years ago as a postdoc of Professor Smith, who's sitting next to me. That's where I started this cook stove business. It was quite different that time in terms of how many people are interested in the topic. But I also work on the outdoor air pollution and look into health risk, what the policies can really try to improve the situation like that. So let me first start with the study that I have done during the 2008 Beijing Olympics. As you all know, that the Beijing's air quality problem has been very severe for a long time, but just to make sure that the athletes will perform well or not affected too much, that Beijing has to make sure that 6 weeks the air quality will be acceptable. So there was a very aggressive set of measures implemented during that time, and so Beijing residents had a fortune to enjoy about 6 weeks of relatively clean air. What I did is I said, well, let's see, we really can see impact in a group of very young, healthy 20-year-olds that live in Beijing. What we did is we're not looking to the symptoms. We're not looking to their record of going to the hospital, that kind of thing, because we know that's not going to be seen. But indeed, we went to see the cardiovascular and the respiratory risk factors. Things like blood pressure, that's more easily understandable, but we also measured some biochemical markers in our body, and which reflect a long-term risk for cardiovascular disease. Those things are that whatever stress is going to cause our body with increased oxidative stress levels, with increased inflammation. That's what we did, and just to compare those levels from before to during to post the Olympics, we do see these changes significantly. And when the level air quality got improved during the Olympics, that we saw those risk factors also get improved. So that really tells us that sometimes we're looking for evidence for big changes as well. I did something. Let me see if we can see fewer bodies in the dead bodies, or we'll have a fewer cases for respiratory or whatever diseases. But even in those very healthy and young people, we can see improvement in those. Otherwise, you cannot see. But we know those are the risk factors for your life. So I think maybe we can learn something that when we try to evaluate cooking technologies that will be, used in settings we should keep in mind. Sometimes if we don't see immediate, really clinical level changes, does not mean there's no changes for long-term health risk or disease risk.
It's wonderful. And it sounds like there'll be many lessons from that work for research that's going on interventions for household air pollution. I'd like to maybe close at least the initial panel discussion with Professor Tami Bond, and then leave us some time for questions. And Professor Bond, she's based at the University of Illinois in Urbana. She was recently awarded a MacArthur Foundation Fellowship for her work on black carbon and really synthesizing the impact of what I come to understand is basically soot, as it's sometimes called in the atmosphere, as having a much more profound impact on climate change, and also identifying how household air pollution, burning of biomass, free burning of biomass, is really a very significant contributor to that problem. So I was hoping that Professor Bond could maybe reflect in the context of this kind of exciting moment when we're hearing about really significant interventions happening in Ghana, India, Kenya, other places that are moving towards really clean fuels. Where you've come to in terms of where this sits in the development agenda going forward, particularly as in all of our minds post 2015.
Thank you. Well, so I can talk a bit about black carbon, and I will just talk a bit because that's not the whole story. Let me tell you first a bit about what people expect to hear from me, which is that black carbon is a very funny thing. It comes out of smoke. It's the black part of smoke. And the reason people are interested in it in terms of climate change is that it absorbs all the light that touches it, and that causes it to warm the atmosphere. Black carbon, per gram of black carbon, you get about 800 times more warming than a gram of CO2, but it happens all in about a week. So people are talking about reducing black carbon as a way to slow climate change. Let me back up from there, though, because the story here is not just about this one very interesting little particle, which we can talk about in scientific terms. The story is that we haven't quite been comprehensive enough. So when people talked about climate change, they were thinking CO2, methane, whatever is covered by the Kyoto Protocol. It turns out there are many, many other things emitted from burning biofuel and burning anything that have effects on the atmosphere. So, ladies and gentlemen, we are in the Anthropocene era. What this means is that there are enough people doing enough things, burning enough fuel to alter the composition of the atmosphere. I think we all know that. But it means that every decision we make is magnified 1 billion, 2 billion, 3 billion times. When you walk into a home and you see the stove that is small and the lady is coughing, and I agree with Kirk, the health impacts should be number one on our agenda. You often don't think about where that goes because it comes out of the chimney and it seems to disappear. But it doesn't disappear. It stays in the atmosphere, and through our activities, not just those of people burning biofuel, but everything we do, we're changing the composition, the color, the oxidative capacity, the nature of the atmosphere. And so in the post-2015, or even the now agenda, what we should be doing is charting a course to how we will handle energy in the future and what it will do to the atmosphere, whether that is caused by CO2 or caused by all the other things from smoke. And so I'm just going to say a little bit about what it means to be comprehensive. We've talked about indoor air pollution. For a very long time, Kirk Smith was the lone voice in the wilderness talking about biofuel indoor air pollution. thank you all for joining him in this journey. That air pollution goes outside, as he mentioned. It affects neighborhoods. It affects cities. Air pollution is no longer an urban question. Everything we do in rural areas also affects enormous continental plumes that you can see from space. Wow. We used to think about air pollution, and then climate change came on the agenda, and all of a sudden we realized that the welfare and the atmosphere of our descendants might be important, not just our children, but our grandchildren, a few generations away. And now it's coming back, and we're saying, look, the smoke has climate change now. And so broadening our focus to how what we do touches every facet of the atmosphere, every facet of health, is really needed to get people on board. Some people are driven by health, some people are driven by climate change, some people are driven by air pollution. This issue touches all of those. When people think about climate change, they often think about a specific type of vulnerability. They're concerned about shifting weather patterns or lack of water. It usually doesn't come down to how many degrees, except in very broad terms. The thing that really gets people is the vulnerability at very specific levels, whether it's the sensitivity of the Arctic to the climate change that's occurring and the rapid melt, or to people in poverty who don't have the resources to adapt. What we should be looking at, and what I hope we will be looking at from now on, is how we address, hold ourselves accountable for, and manage vulnerability. And that goes for climate change, it goes for the health effects, and as we manage vulnerability, bringing clean household energy to people, as we've seen, begins to empower them and enable them to deal with the vulnerability that surely is coming. So I would just issue a call to everybody to acknowledge one step, 2 steps outside of what you're thinking now, because there is more to what we choose. And I believe that one of the things we need to do is choose clean household energy, clean household services, because those are the things that will make the better future possible all across the board. No matter what your issue is, I believe that's what you're here for. Thank you.
By the clock, we have 2 minutes left for questions. I'm wondering if the moderators will maybe give us, or the organizers of the conference will give us an extra 5 minutes or so. But I suspect that there are questions from the audience, and I think Sumi Mehta will also help me sort of identify who would be next.
Thank you very much for a wonderful presentation. I wonder if a result of any one of the studies that you talked about, both at Johns Hopkins, Bloomberg, and the work that you're doing, if there are any access to any one of those.
I'm sorry, could you repeat that again?
Access to the result of the study that you actually talked about.
Oh,
is that in open source?
Yeah, not quite yet. The manuscript's being revised, and it'll be probably in publication in a few months. It's been accepted, so, but I'm happy to share the results.
Sorry, just ask if you ask a question, if you could identify yourselves, that would be great. It'll help us. Maybe in retrospect, it would be great to know who you are.
I'm Manos Harrison from Last Mile 4D.
Am I missing any? I'm sort of blinded by the lights here, so I can't fully see everybody. Oh, it looks like there's a question here.
David Gillette from the Newton, Massachusetts, San Juan del Sur, Nicaragua, sister city project where we have lots of eco-stoves pushing forward even as we speak. This is a factual question for Tami. does charcoal put less soot into the environment than wood?
I think yes, but it puts a lot of greenhouse gases into the atmosphere because of the production.
Could I add just that? I think charcoal in traditional production methods is the most greenhouse gas intensive energy system in the world. We've done some work on this.
Nathaniel Mpoke from World Stove. My question is for Dr. Zhang. You had mentioned in your talk the biomarkers that your studies have done. Can you elaborate a little bit on that, please?
Yes, I think for the cardiovascular system, we did measure things like a very commonly understandable ones like blood pressure, heart rate, that sort of thing. But also there are proteins that floating in our circulatory system, like this p-selectin, which is a marker for blood coagulation. If more of those you have, it's more potent to more likely get a blood clot, that sort of thing. But of course, there's lots of things that indicating our body under chronic inflammation and for the lung, for the systemic system. So yes, there are lots of them. We try to measure them. They have the relevance to clinical outcomes, but they are not. Some of them are still not yet used in the clinical setting for, have a benchmark like a blood pressure.
I think we'll be able to take one more question after this.
I'm Praveen Dhamija from India. My question is to Professor Smith. Sir, you are aware about the program in the country, in India, which we have recently launched for putting forth 3 million cookstoves. And as we discussed in Delhi, that this is an intermediate stage to the WHO guidelines, which have come up recently. So what is your view about thermoelectric stoves? Should India go in for thermoelectric stoves? Would you think they'll be better than the efficient stoves which we are promoting?
Thermoelectric, you mean stoves that generate their own electricity? Is that what you mean?
Yes.
Yeah, okay. Well, people may not know that some of the advanced biomass stoves actually have a thermoelectric generator in them. It's a material that creates electricity from the heat of the stove. The big advantage to that is that it can operate the blower. And then if you're going to get good, my opinion, if you're going to get really good combustion in biomass stoves, it has to be forced draft. That means a blower. And in in these areas that don't have reliable electricity, even in areas with the reliable electricity, rather than stringing a wire down to the stove, why not generate the electricity in the stove itself for the blower? And there are some models coming online that do that. So yes, I think that is the wave of the future if you're going to get truly clean combustion. The other advantage to it is, and it's probably a serious marketing advantage, is you can charge your cell phone from the stove, and that gets the man of the house interested instead of wandering to some other village or paying somebody to charge the cell phone in a place where there's no electricity. You can charge it yourself from the stove. What you hope is that he doesn't set up a business running the stove all day long, charging people's cell phones. So. But let me take the opportunity to say, I think the current evidence is if biomass is ever going to step up to the clean as we now understand it, it's probably going to have to be forced draft and pellets. That is, make the biomass uniform in size and shape, and moisture and other characteristics. Then you can burn biomass extremely cleanly with a blower and pellets. And the pellets can be locally derived from renewable sources. But of course, it's means creating a commercial fuel cycle. Somebody has to make those pellets and somebody has to buy them. You lose the big advantage of the available fuel than just gathering it yourself. But we know there are lots of easy, cheap, available things that people do that are unhealthy. I mean, the other examples in sanitation. Defecating in the field is cheap and easy, but it's not healthy. So those behaviors may have to change, but the derivation of the fuel can be local.
Sorry, we're going to maybe have the final question from Roger Glass from Fogarty International Center. I apologize. Oh, you have the mic. Okay, sorry.
Tokumbo Ishmael from Alethea in Nigeria. Question to Professor Smith. You mentioned about some study in India around distribution of gas stoves, and I was wondering if you could elaborate a bit more on the distribution mechanism that was used there.
Maybe just for efficiency, we can also get Roger Glass's question and take those together as the final.
Thanks very much. Roger Glass from the National Institutes of Health. I thought this was a fabulous panel and underscores the critical importance of research on health, not only on mortality, but on asthma, birth weight, cancer, heart disease, and the like. And I think that part of the evaluation and the issue that will drive this for the long term will be documentation of the evidence on health impacts, not only mortality, but morbidity. And the second part of the research agenda is the ability to monitor everything we do, because with that monitoring in-house at the end of the mile, the last mile, that will really allow us to move this agenda forward. So I really compliment this most important session, and I think there's a lot more that we need to do to assess the health benefits in the long term. And Kirk, you've done an amazing job to train a generation of young people to begin that effort, as we've seen on this.
From them. So the question on LPG. Well, I mean, this is a really exciting effort in India, but it's, first of all, I should say, there are other countries. Ghana, for example, we heard this morning, is promoting LPG. I understand Cameroon is, Indonesia is, Brazil had a big program on LPG, so it's not just India, but India is, doing it now. And one of the, I mean, it's a very exciting effort. It's kind of long and complicated, but let me say, one of the things they're doing is targeting better the subsidies. So they take the subsidy away from me, and everybody else in this room wouldn't get the subsidy anymore in India, moving that, and then trying to, you take it away from the rich, yes, that's good, but then you have to maintain that subsidy and move it to the other end of the spectrum to the poor, so that over time, that set of subsidies doesn't increase, because that's politically difficult, but it moves down the income spectrum. That's the trick, is to take it away from the rich as development occurs, fewer people deserve the subsidy, move it down the income spectrum, spread it out into rural areas, change the way distribution is done in rural areas, which is rather arcane in many countries, deliver directly to houses, give smaller cylinders, have microfinance, have a more advanced technology. LPG technology is 60 years old. I mean, it needs to be more efficient. Use modern tools such as bank accounts and cell phones and all of this to monitor all of this. This is a very exciting agenda. Now, how far it can go and how, there are political pressures like in everything. People like their subsidies, even if they're rich. But nevertheless, that's the thing, is the basic idea is to take the subsidies, move it down the income spectrum.
Okay, well, thank you everybody for joining us, and really amazing panel and a very, very exciting decade to come.